But before we get into our subject matter, I'm going to start and have the board members introduce themselves to our audience. Matthew, can I start with you?
Of course you can. Matthew Gifford from Brookline.
David Roach from Sutton.
Arlene Chernow from Jamaica Plain.
Gerald Chitavian from Cambridge.
Beverly Holmes from Springfield.
I'm Maura Banta from Melrose.
Mitchell Chester, Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education.
Jim DiTullio, Secretary Revels Designee and General Counsel at the Executive Office of Education.
Jeff Howard from Reading. Jeff Howard from Reading.
Vanessa Calderon Rosado from Milton.
Great, thank you. And I know that Board Member Ruth Kaplan will be joining us around 5 o'clock. So again, thank you and welcome to our special guests. This is a topic the board has looked forward to discussing for a long time. We know of its importance to Massachusetts. We know of its importance to this country as we become more competitive moving forward with a better aligned curriculum and a better assessment system. So with that, I'm going to turn to the Commissioner and ask him to tee up this session.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased that we've got this session scheduled. The board has really expressed a lot of interest in assessment and where we are with our assessment program. Has asked a number of questions over the years, quite appropriately. Early in my tenure, we spent a fair amount of time on this topic. I don't think we've spent any engaged, deliberate time on the topic since. And so tonight is an opportunity to do that. We have with us Michael Cohen and Laura Slover of Achieve, and one of the roles that Achieve plays is Achieve is the managing partner for the multi-state initiative that you've heard me refer to as the PARCC initiative, Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, that we're very engaged in as a state. And so I'm going to call on them in a minute to share with you what that project is designed to do. I also want to acknowledge Sandy Boyd. Sandy, give a wave in the back. Sandy Boyd from Achieve, who's also with Mike and Laura. But you have, what do we have? 3 handouts, I believe, PowerPoint handouts. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes up front, and I'm going to refer to the handout that has the grid at the bottom on the 2011 MCAS testing program. So I'm going to work off of this for my brief introduction. And that grid shows you on a quick glance what we test, what subjects we test, and at what grade level we test that. And you can see, I think it's self-explanatory. If you turn to the second page, slide number 3, just to set in context today's discussion, and this is the modern history of Massachusetts testing, are the first operational MCAS tests were administered more than a decade ago, 1998. The first class that was required to earn a certificate of determination to pass the tests in ELA and math was the class of 2003. In 2006, and back then we weren't testing in the full range of grades and subjects that we're testing in now. We didn't test in science. We didn't test every grade 3 through 8. In 2006, in response to federal legislation, the No Child Left Behind Act, we filled in the grades that we weren't testing at, and we're testing each student, each grade, 3 through 8, as well as the 10th grade test in math and in English language arts. In some grades in English language arts, we test both reading and writing. In some grades, just reading. We've since added the science test. And then when I arrived in 2008, we were at the end of a contract with our testing vendor, Measured Progress. And based on discussions with the board, we rebid that contract. And in that rebidding, we asked the vendors that bid on our testing program to help us stretch the program, extend the program to accomplish a few things. One was we wanted to be sure that we were assessing the full complement of skills that we know are important. And at that time that we rebid the contract, we were anticipating the recommendations coming out of the Task Force on 21st Century Skills that Gerald headed. And so in that RFP, we asked the bidders to anticipate what recommendations might come out of that contract. We asked the contractor to include history. We anticipated the history coming online. We asked the contractor to think about ways to better connect the testing program to the day-to-day life of classroom teachers by creating some components of the assessment system that would actually be administered in the course of the year as part of the classroom experience that would then contribute to the final outcome for students, the final scores for students. We had I'm not gonna say how many bids because I don't remember how many bids we had, and we awarded the new contract again to Measured Progress, the testing company that had been administering our program up until then. Well, what happened was with the fiscal bottom falling out on us, and watching our budgets cut successively, beginning with the FY09 budget, and some of you remember this. I remember it very clearly. We went through mid-year a couple of rounds of cuts, and in successive years more cuts. The testing budget was cut. And so the only thing we could hold on to, the only thing we could afford given our state budget was the core testing program. We had to abandon all of the new components, the new features that we had hoped to be able to develop with the assistance of state funding. And we subsequently, I recommended and you adopted a suspension of the history and social science testing. We kept on course. We had in the pipeline the addition of science and the technology engineering to earn a certificate of determination, and so we've stayed on course with that piece of it. We've known, and you've shared with me, I mean, our assessment, the MCAS, is considered state-of-the-art among state testing programs. It does a good job of measuring what students have learned in the course of a year. But we know that there are limitations to that testing program, not least of which there's limitations to a test that's sit down and take this test in the next hour or two at the end of a school year, limits what it is that you can assess. And as a result, we've been very interested in what a next generation assessment might look like. We anticipated that in the rebidding of the contract, but we're unable to carry that forward. Well, the good thing is, I believe, that along came a funding opportunity from the U.S. Department of Education. So under the auspices of Race to the Top, the federal government issued an opportunity for consortia of states, not single states, to come together around the development of a next generation assessment program that would, among other things, measure students' reading and math progress beginning in third grade at least, up through the high school years, and that would be anchored at the high school years in an assessment of a student's readiness for college and careers. Another feature of our current MCAS program that is not there, where our MCAS test, our 10th grade test, was not designed to assess whether or not students are ready for college and careers. And as a result, we have the phenomenon in Massachusetts where more than a third, almost 40% of our public school graduates who do fine on our assessment end up being placed into non-credit bearing coursework when they get to our public higher ed campuses. So we took advantage of the Race to the Top opportunity to be part of a consortium of states. And we have invested very strongly our expertise, our assessment staff. Bob Bickerton's very involved in it. Liz Davis, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, is very involved in it, and as are a number of our staff in the what's now known as the PARCC project, the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers. And that assessment brings to us many of the features that we had hoped to accomplish on our own but are unable to because of limited state funding. So I invited Mike Cohen to come and share with you a fairly high-level overview of the PARCC project, what it's about, what it's designed to do, and an opportunity to ask questions about that project, because we really haven't spent a lot of time on unpacking what this PARCC initiative is. So, Madam Chair, with your permission, I turn it over to Mike and Laura.
Thank you, and again, welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's really a pleasure to have an opportunity to visit with you this afternoon. I think this is probably the third time I've had a chance to visit with the board recently. One time, I think, around college and career readiness and the work of the American Diploma Project, which Massachusetts is one of our leading states. I think I was here for a session on 21st century skills at one point, and I believe I've been here at least once around discussions on the Common Core state standards. So I'm pleased to be back again. My colleague Laura Slover is Senior Vice President at Achieve, and she heads up the work on PARCC that we do. Achieve is the project management partner for the work. We try to make sure the work keeps moving forward in a coherent, effective, and timely manner. So what we thought we would do this afternoon is take about 15 or 20 minutes to give you a really high-level overview of the work of PARCC, give you an idea of what the states are trying to develop. Not get into too much detail on any particular piece of it, but wait to see where you want to take the conversation, what kind of questions you have, and we will be happy to spend the bulk of our time interacting with you rather than talking at you. So we have just a small number of slides to go through. The first of which is basically gives you an idea of the 24 states that are in PARCC. And there are a couple things about the states that I want to mention. The ones that are in dark blue, purple, whatever color that is, are governing states. The other states are participating states. The distinction here is that the governing states literally are on a governing board comprised of the commissioners of education from each of those states. That is the body that makes the decisions about how PARCC will be designed, how it will be developed, what other tools will be developed along with it. They are essentially your equivalent for the this consortium. The decision making is in their hands. Mitchell is the chair of the governing board, and there are several reasons why that's really good, not the least of which in the context of this conversation is one of Mitchell's roles is to make sure that what gets developed here represents the next generation of MCAS. It basically enables you to do the kinds of things that you've been planning on doing. Much as when the Common Core were being developed, you were a bellwether state, and the question was, can we make this good enough so Massachusetts would want to adopt those standards? Much of the conversation in PARCC basically is focused on whether the PARCC assessments will be good enough so that you would want to use it in lieu of MCAS. You'll see as we go through how you want to make that call, but you are basically setting the benchmark here, and it's a good benchmark to have to beat. Let's see what else I want to say about those. The states in light colored blue are participating states. They are not as invested as the governing states are. Some of them are in the other consortia as well, the Smarter Balanced Consortia, waiting to see how these tests develop and play out and decide which way they want to go. The other thing I'd want to mention to you as part of the governance and advisory structure is we have an advisory committee on college and career readiness that is it's comprised of higher education leaders from around the participating states. Richard Freeland is the co-chair of that. So Massachusetts is well represented and positioned in the governance structure. Laura, let's go to the next one. Right, so now you see that Massachusetts is the co-chair, and the fiscal agent for this state that manages the money is Florida. I think now we're ready to go. Oh, and Achieve is the project manager. We've got a little work to do on it. Yeah, right. So you'll see we've got 6 aspects of the PARCC program that we want to talk you through. I'm going to turn this over to Laura, who will briefly describe the first 4, then I'll come back and talk about the last 2, and then we'll open it for questions. So we really keep this brief, focused, and ultimately interactive.
So good afternoon. I'm Laura Slover. I am the Senior Vice President overseeing PARCC, as Mike said. In my other life, my private life, I'm a DC resident, and I also sit on the DESE State Board. So I've been on that side of the table. What we're going to do is try to keep it brief and just elicit your questions so we can have a back and forth. These are the priorities of PARCC, of the PARCC assessment, that have been agreed to by the 24 states that lead PARCC. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the first one and really follow up on what Mike said in his lead, which is that we are in some ways judging quality by, is this good enough for Massachusetts to adopt as its comprehensive assessment system? So a lot of the conversations we have about quality of items are really driven from some of the people back here, Barbara Libby, Susan Weddle on the ELA side, and Liz and Bob, who are keeping our feet to the fire and making sure that this assessment really is built from the bottom with very, very high quality items that are aligned directly to the Common Core standards. Some nuances about the Common Core standards that I think are important for the sake of this conversation are how deeply embedded they are in practice. In mathematics, there's a whole strand around mathematical practices, and the items on this assessment will not just cover content, but also the practices. In ELA literacy, one of the key shifts in the standards is its emphasis in writing, not just writing to a prompt, but really writing using evidence from a variety of sources to marshal that evidence and make a claim. And so the writing assessments that will be included in PARCC will model that and really try to delve into that kind of performance. One of the key tenets of this assessment project is that it's not just a one-time end-of-the-year multiple choice exam that PARCC will develop. It will really have multiple components. I'm going to skip to the next slide so you can see that. It's the third slide in your packet, and I'll go back to the previous slide in a moment. But this slide really shows the design, and I want to hone in on the right-hand side of the slide, because it shows the 2 summative components, one of which is at the end of the year, computer-based, very innovative set of assessment items that will be delivered on a computer and scored very rapidly so that students and teachers get results very quickly. The second little clipboard, I guess they're little clipboards to the right, is a performance-based assessment. So many of the kinds of things that Mitchell was talking about, trying to do some more curriculum-embedded pieces of work, really you'll see these in this element of the assessment, which is a performance-based assessment that really calls on students to not just regurgitate knowledge, but also to apply that knowledge perhaps through an extended writing prompt, or in mathematics through a multi-step problem. So those 2 components really make up the summative score. There's 2 other components that are worth talking about here, which are the diagnostic components, which you'll see all the way on the left-hand side of your screen. This is designed to be a flexible tool that will give data back at any time in the year. It's designed to be used when a teacher needs it, so it's at the ready, and can give a teacher information about how well his or her student is doing and where they might need additional help. That middle, the second from the left, is a mid-year component that is really designed to give students much more practice in extended problems and writing to sources, research-based projects as well. Right now, some states plan to use that in a summative way, but many plan to use that as an additional formative assessment to give data back in real time to teachers about their students and prepare them for that performance-based assessment. I think that's all I want to say about quality. I'm going to go on.
Laura, you should point out the speaking and listening component as well.
Thank you. I skipped that. On the bottom, there is an additional assessment, the speaking and listening assessment. This is in PARCC's attempt to really faithfully measure the standards, which include considerable speaking and listening, a performance assessment that will require a student to do a formal presentation in front of an audience to be determined by the teacher, whether that's a classroom audience or a more public audience, to be scored using agreed upon rubrics across the consortium, and while not included in the summative score, to give back data to a teacher about how students perform in that area. So it's really trying to make sure that students can apply their knowledge, be able to present to a group, and then to engage in rich discourse back and forth as their audience questions them about the topic. Just to be clear, those two to the right are going to be combined into a single summative score, and then standards will be set that include those two across the consortium. So another way in which PARCC, and Mitchell alluded to this, the commissioner alluded to this, that it's going to be different is it's in its laser-like focus on preparing students for college and career. And so there will be a number of components that try to build that stairway all the way to college readiness at the end of high school, starting with some tools around diagnostic assessments for K-2 students that teachers in those grades can give to their students to get them essentially ready for learning the standards in third grade, and so that the PARCC assessments are not a surprise for them when they hit third grade. So those are diagnostic tools, again designed to be used very flexibly. Teacher can administer those to students at any time, and not really given in the sense of all the kids sit down at the same time to take an assessment, much more in the lines along the lines of activities, rubrics, and kind of assignments that students might do rapidly to give teachers a pretty quick sense of where they are in their learning continuum. Then, as I mentioned, there's 3 through 8 assessments in both English language arts and mathematics, high school assessments in mathematics and English language arts literacy. In English language arts, those will be grade-based assessments, so in 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade. And then in mathematics, PARCC has decided to develop 2 sequences, a rather traditional sequence, what you might think of as Algebra 1 geometry and Algebra 2, and then an integrated sequence, which is integrated math 1, 2, and 3. And there'll be some choice as to which sequence a state goes with, but each of those sequences will be rolled up into giving a student a score that determines whether they're ready to enter directly into college first-year credit-bearing courses. Lastly, for those students who may not be ready or need a little bit of extra help to be ready for those credit-bearing courses, PARCC has determined that it will develop what we're calling college-ready tools, but essentially they are bridge courses that provide students additional support if in that 11th grade year or even in that 12th grade year they're taking that final PARCC assessment but not scoring at the kind of ready level. It'll give them additional tools and resources so they can get ready and enter into credit-bearing courses. Third, in terms of supporting educators in the classroom, I think it's one of the hallmarks of PARCC, and one of the things I'm really pleased about working on PARCC is that it's not just a test, it's really more than a test, and it's about providing supports for students and teachers as they move their kids towards this track towards college and career ready. Some of the tools that I thought would be most interesting to mention are, first of all, what we're calling content frameworks. And over the course of the last year, PARCC has spent a lot of time working with content experts across the 24 states to build what are called content frameworks, and they were released in October. They essentially provide a bridge between the Common Core standards and the PARCC assessments by highlighting within each grade what are the key foundational topics that are most important for students to learn and where teachers should place the most emphasis, both in terms of their instruction but also in terms of where that test is going to home in on and what are the big ideas for assessment. Some other important tools are professional development tools to really help unpack the Common Core and the PARCC assessments so that teachers can start getting a sense of what the assessments will look like. And importantly, since the data coming from these assessments are going to look so different, we'll have some professional development for teachers around what the data will look like and how they might use that to move student performance. Another really important tool, and something we've heard time and time again from educators in the field, is a set of rich examples, prototypes, and sample tasks that can really show examples of what the expectation is on those assessments and help teachers as they prepare their students know what the target is. And we're working actually with 2 public research universities right now to build examples in each content area, English language arts literacy and mathematics, and those will start coming out and be made public over the summer, and we'll continue to make more and more public and available over the next 3 years of development. Let's see, the last item before I turn it back over to Mike is around developing 21st century technology-based assessments. So I think it's fair to say that one of the most innovative things about the assessment is that it will be delivered entirely online. In grades 3, 4, and 5, it will be delivered online, but students can take it on using pencil and paper to write their answers. But starting in grade 6 and all the way through the end of high school, the test will actually be administered and taken online. And this is really important for a couple reasons. First of all, it's using the best of the technology and really allowing technology to enable great innovation in terms of item types. So kids will be having more engaging items. The items can build within a computer-based, technology-rich platform. You can do a lot more engaging and interactive kinds of things with items. Equally importantly, the computer-based environment will allow for economies of scale and really drive down costs. And then it will also allow much more rapid turnaround of results, which will have a great impact on, you know, I don't know about in Massachusetts, but in DC we wait until August to get our test scores back. So it will really shift that dynamic to making sure that kids are getting the data and teachers are getting data before the end of the school year. I think I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Mike to finish out this slide.
Thank you, Laura. I just want to talk about the last 2 issues that are there, accountability and cost. One of the things that brought the PARCC states together was that they all shared first of all, they all were states where accountability, school-level accountability, was a significant part of their reform strategy. Hardly the only part, but a very significant part in terms of driving and promoting improvement in achievement. And all the states understood that what gets tested and what the test looks like actually drives instruction in many classrooms, oftentimes in the past not necessarily driving the best kind of instruction. So there's a real commitment to making sure that the kinds of items and tasks that are on the assessments would signal the kind of instruction that ought to be going on in the classroom. So Laura talked about the performance-based assessments, talked about in English language arts, performance assessments that require students to read complex texts and write a coherent argument, drawing on the evidence in it. If that's what teachers teach to, that's probably not such a bad thing. So the idea was to make sure that the tests are used for accountability and can drive instruction in the right way. Also making sure that when they use for school accountability, that they are psychometrically strong enough to be able to support the kind of judgments that you'll be making here in Massachusetts and elsewhere about schools that are in the bottom 5% or the bottom 20% or whatever. Make sure that the test is robust enough to support those judgments. As the PARCC got underway, it was clear that Massachusetts and other states are also using summative assessments to make judgments about the effectiveness of educators, and we're paying very careful attention to making sure that the tests are psychometrically strong enough to support those kinds of judgments. Thirdly, as Laura mentioned, there will be common cut scores across the states. So whether we call it proficient or on track for college readiness, whatever the performance labels are, it will mean the same thing in each of the 24 states in PARCC. That will provide for a level of comparability in terms of performance of Massachusetts student schools compared with the other states in ways that are impossible to do now. We are working closely with the Smarter Balance Consortia. They're taking a different approach to testing, but we're trying to figure out how we can make comparisons between the PARCC states and the Smarter Balance states as well. Again, just for public reporting purposes alone, it provides a different level of information. We are trying to figure out how to make sure that we can embed international comparisons in this assessment as well, most likely drawing on items in PISA that require students to apply what they've learned, so that you can also compare performance of Massachusetts students with those in other countries. So those all fit with the accountability frame that the PARCC states bring to this work. With regard
Mike,
to...
if I might, I just want to make sure the record's clear. You heard Mike refer to the smarter, balanced states. That was not a judgment about us in Massachusetts. I just want to make sure. There are two multi-state assessment consortia, and for reasons I'm not quite clear, how their name evolved to be the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortia. But you know, I sometimes say tongue-in-cheek, those of us in the park have had to get over the stigma of thinking if we're not smarter or balanced, then what are we? So.
Well, I'm not sure, Mitchell, but I think they came up with the name after looking at a package of margarine. And so I don't think there's really as much stigma attached to our name as I used to. I'm not positive about that. We'll do some work to try to figure that out. But in that context, one of the things that we have been very concerned about, that the states have been very concerned about, is the cost of assessments. As Mitchell described in his opening comments, you had a set of innovations you were planning to put into place, but in this fiscal environment, cost is a major factor. So we have spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out how to drive costs down and how to make sure that the assessments are affordable. So let me just mention two things there. One is we've actually spent a fair amount of time trying to understand how much each state actually spends on assessment, what the annual operating costs are, and that's more than a matter of simply looking at the line item in the state budget. And we did a little bit of research to do an apples to apples comparison across the states, and to estimate the cost of the design, implementing the design that Laura showed. So where we are now, when we keep estimating and re-estimating as this work evolves, is that the cost per student per test for the PARCC assessment should be in the neighborhood of about $11 per student, right? 11 for math, 11 for ELA. And that assumes that the performance assessments are scored by teachers. If we ever get to a point where it's possible to use artificial intelligence, automated scoring to score that will drive the cost down even further. In contrast, your tests now run at about $23 per student per test. So we are aiming to drive the cost down lower than what you currently spend. A big part of that, right, has to do with the fact that the assessment is computer-based, right? That dramatically reduces the scoring costs, and it dramatically it eliminates the printing and shipping and all those other costs that are built in. It does require a technology infrastructure that supports that, and I know that's been a discussion here and in every other state. Those are investments that states are looking to make even in difficult times. One of the advantages of making those assessments is that they're investments is that they are investments not just in assessment, but they're investments in improving instruction. You would use that same infrastructure for instructional purposes. So again, we are working to drive the costs down to make sure that these are affordable. I'll also tell you that we're keenly aware of the fact that the federal grant that's paying for the development of the assessments runs out in 2014-2015. It's a 4-year development grant, and so we're already starting now to develop plans for sustaining the assessments over time when the costs will fall on states, presumably, rather than the federal government. And all of the work involved in how we're designing the tests and procuring the tests are all designed to keep the costs moving on a downward slope. So that's kind of the big picture overview of the PARCC assessments. And I think we could go on for a lot more, but rather than do that, we'll stop and see what your questions and concerns and issues are. Thank you for your attention.
Great. So Jeff?
So the only one that's technology based is the end of year assessment.
No. You want to go ahead?
Actually all of the components in that chain of 4 are going to be technology based. The performance-based assessment, the design really calls for it to be delivered via computer, and for students in grade 6 through the end of high school through grade 11 to enter into the computer their responses. And then, to Mike's point, it's still being discussed and researched, actually, the extent to which automated scoring can be used to score the writing performance.
How it's going to be teacher scored.
The model right now includes predominance of teacher score assessment items with a few, as we test out the automated scoring, being automatedly scored. Automatedly scored isn't really the right term, but scored automatically.
I like that term.
Yeah, I like it.
Let me just add one thing. I want to make a distinction between teacher scored or human scored, right? So clearly someone's, unless and until it's possible to do it in an automated fashion, then somebody's got to read the essays and look at the math problems. States, I think, will vary as to whether they want the teachers to do that or whether they want to pay a vendor, for example, to do that. That will partly be a matter of cost. It will partly be a matter of the way those assessments are going to be used in the accountability, particularly the educator evaluation process. So I think those are issues that each state will make, and you'll have to decide that here.
One more question. How do the PARCC tests relate to the NAEP? I mean, are they going to replace the NAEP? Are they going to be correlated? I mean, how are we going to?
Go ahead.
Well, so I'm going to take your second question first. I'll just say it's not the intention of the PARCC states to supplant NAEP. NAEP exists for a purpose that is separate from measuring the extent to which students are mastering a particular curriculum or mastering a set of standards. So it still can serve an important function. The issue of how and whether it'll be correlated, I think, is a really interesting possibility that the states are right now exploring. We've been in contact with folks from NCES who develop and administer the NAEP, and there's a conversation actually across both consortia, the Smarter Balanced and the PARCC consortia, with NAGB officials to talk about whether there could be some internal benchmarking or even item embedding to make sure we kind of have an understanding of how those three instruments are or are not correlated.
Okay. I think Harneen was next, and then David.
Thank you, and thank you for coming, and Commissioner, for setting up this forum. It's really interesting. I feel like I hear a lot about the park, so it's great to hear more specifics about how it's rolling out. So I just have a number of questions, and I'm not sure if they're for you or for you, but just about how it would work here. Have we already I guess first of all, is there an agreement that this is replacing MCAS? I mean, has there been a vote and where are we at in that whole trajectory? And that's just my first. I just have quick questions. Thank you.
Yeah, there is no predetermined commitment to sunset the MCAS and adopt PARCC. What I have made a commitment to is that if PARCC demonstrates itself to be a step forward for us, a next generation that we had hoped to build ourselves, doesn't represent a watering down of our expectations, our academic expectations for our students, that I would likely recommend to this board that we have a transition plan to move away from the MCAS and bring the PARCC project up as a replacement for the MCAS. There would have to be a number of decision points in that regard. For example, what happens with the exit exam requirement that exists? How would we handle that? How would we what would a transition look like? What would the impact on our accountability systems be? Those are all areas that we're talking about internally in the department right now. But bottom line for me is if PARCC turns out to be what I hope it will be, which is a real advancement in how we assess and what we assess, a real step forward, that I would recommend to this board that we make that transition.
Okay, thank you. I just was confused about where we were with the process. So I guess just a couple questions then about it in terms of how it would actually work. I don't, and maybe this is all being figured out, but when I look at all these different 4 stages, or the 4 clipboards, I guess, here about the different kinds of assessments, it looks to me like a lot of time and a lot of hours spent on diagnostics, on the assessments that students can do rapidly, mid-year performance, speaking, you know, it just seems like a lot of assessment time. I don't know, or testing time, one could say. So I'm not sure how that, it's just a concern, I guess there's no answer. How does this relate to how much time is already currently spent? How are districts going to think about their own whole assessment system that they've developed internally, and then how is that either replaced or aligned with this, and how are we ensuring that our kids aren't just being assessed to the loss of actually being taught, which is my own concern about assessment and testing. So that's just one thing. And then my other kind of question, I'm glad you raised the thing about the computer labs, because that just seems extraordinarily costly. I mean, we have a lot of schools that have 1 computer lab. It's not like, you know, you're going to have one group, 1 class at a time go through this, even if you thought about building additional capacity in the schools, not just to purchase the equipment, but to hire all the technology specialists that are going to maintain that equipment. It's just a huge cost. I have no idea how that fits into all this. That seems to, I mean, I think the idea of computerized assessment is a lot simpler and quicker, and ultimately, you know, is where everything's going. It just seems like a tremendous challenge to get from here to there. And my third, just technical question is, I didn't understand the difference between kind of a cut score, high school graduation, and being college ready. And I'm interested in this. Obviously, Board Chertavian's task force, we're looking at this whole issue about, you know, college and career ready. The 3 levels of the math, I guess, sequencing, are those all, I mean, is the idea that you're going to be placed in one and then you graduate no matter what if you pass it, or is this only connected to college readiness? It just wasn't clear to me, that piece. And I'm just interested because, you know, thinking about people not, you know, needing the bridge courses and all that kind of stuff, I think is an interesting idea, so.
It's a great set of questions. I'm going to leave the kind of the last set for Mike and Laura to respond to. If I can remember the first 2, the amount of testing time, right? The mind's working right now. The amount of testing time's a critical issue. And I know you and I have had this conversation, Harneen. Many of our schools are doing a lot of assessment right now, a lot of assessment. Only a small part of that is what the state requires, is the MCAS, right? We have schools that do some kind of diagnostic, that do benchmark tests, that do interim assessments. We've got schools that assess as frequently as weekly. And our goal is to build an assessment system in this project that would in fact prove itself to be valuable to the point where districts would abandon some of the other assessment that they're doing, because this system would hang together so well. It would offer the possibility of an early in the year diagnostic to get a beat on where a student is and where you're starting from with that student. It would offer the possibility of giving teachers feedback through the mid-year assessment that's very, very performance based, and doesn't look like a regular test. Looks more like a set of tasks or an assignment that a student might have that in fact would give teachers signals about whether or not they're delivering a rich curriculum to their students and whether or not they're likely preparing their students for success in the end of the year components of the assessment. So that is the hope, that it's not layered on top of everything that folks are doing, that folks see this as sufficiently valuable and holding together as a system that they would jettison some of the testing they're doing. The technology piece is huge, and for us, and I know for some of the other states that are competing, and I suspect that in the short run we're going to have to offer some paper and pencil alternatives for some of our buildings. We're doing a couple things to get ready though for having an infrastructure. So one of them is we're building a gap analysis tool, and again Mike and Laura can flesh this out more, that would be a way for a state to actually get a strong analysis of each building's technology infrastructure. The problem right now is that what we know about buildings' technology infrastructure is from surveys we do, and a building will tell us, yeah, we're connected, we're online. Well, as you said, it might be that there's a dozen computers total in the building that really have connectivity, really have broadband capability, really are up to speed in their processor strength, that they could handle an assessment that's fed through the internet, and it might take, that school might have 700 kids in it, and it might take that school 3 months just tying up those computers. So we need to know that. So we're building a gap analysis tool that would actually allow us real time to assess remotely the capacity of those schools. We'd tee it up so that folks in those schools would go online at a given point in time, and this would really give us a beat on it. We're also exploring, so this is very preliminary. But I just had a conversation this morning with Treasurer Grossman, and among the treasurer's responsibilities is oversight of the school building authority. And we had a conversation about whether or not we could commit school building authority funds to supporting the strengthening of the building by building infrastructure. And I think that's something that he's very interested in doing, so we laid out a plan for carrying that conversation forward. So we have to work on building the infrastructure. To Mike's point, I think Mike made this point, or maybe Laura, this investment would be powerful in a couple of ways. One is that that we have not in Massachusetts invested systematically through state funds in capacity in at least, somebody here has to guide me, at least 10 years that bond money has been applied to support district upgrading of infrastructure. Number two, increasingly, districts are able to purchase online versions of instructional materials that are very costly to purchase in hard copy, textbooks, for example. And many school districts will go a decade or more between textbook purchases because of the expense. More and more publishers are making this material available online in ways that can be upgraded. And so it gives districts a chance to upgrade an infrastructure that'll be used for instructional purposes as well. The third piece that I would highlight is my sense is that if anything, we may be exacerbating inequalities in our building infrastructures. I'm watching a number of districts and buildings really upgrade in ways that we would want every building in the state to be upgraded. I think of Burlington High School. Not only have they created wireless throughout the high school, but every student, 9 through 12, has an iPad in their hand, and the teachers have spent time developing curriculum to be delivered wirelessly. And we have lots of other places in the Commonwealth that just don't have the wherewithal to take that on. And so I'm hoping that we can get a state investment in this. More to come. In regard to the career readiness component of this, and there's some policy decisions, I think, embedded in Harneen's question in terms of how does a college-ready standard relate to a high school graduation requirement as well.
Do you want to take that?
Yeah. So I guess the one thing I'd advise against, right, is requiring students to meet a college-ready standard on this assessment in order to earn a high school diploma, because you'll wind up in one of two places. You will either wind up with one of the lowest college-ready standards in the country or the lowest graduation rates in the country. Those seem like poor choices, and you didn't make that choice with MCAS. Right? You needed to meet the needs improvement level in order to earn a high school diploma. You didn't need to be proficient or advanced. So you might think of it in the same way for now, that if you continue with some form of a high school exit exam, that it be set at a realistic level that will enable you to keep advancing the way you have been, but not so far that students won't be able to get there in a realistic time, but still set the college ready level at an accurate way. And one way to think about a college ready, as the point of a college ready assessment, would be to say to a student, say at the end of 11th grade when they've completed relevant courses and taken the assessments, to either be able to say to them, congratulations, you've done so well on these assessments that we know that when you get to college, you'll be able, or 2-year college, 4-year college, you'll be able to do credit-bearing work. You won't need to be in a remedial course. So we're telling you that now, right? You might also say to a student, well, you didn't do that well on the assessment. Given where you are now in 11th grade, right, if you wind up in a public post-secondary institution in Massachusetts after you graduate, you're going to have to take a placement exam and find out then whether you're ready to do credit-bearing work or need remedial work. But since we know now that you're not ready, here's some suggestions of what you can do in your senior year in high school so that you can fill in the skill gaps that you have. Those are, you might think of that as using assessments for opening doors for students as opposed to closing them, even temporarily, for students. So it's a very different way to think about it. On the career ready issue, this has been something we've had lots of discussions about internally. I know that these are an active set of discussions here in Massachusetts. In fact, Laura and I and Sandy Boyd, who's with us, spent a couple of hours this afternoon with our colleagues at Jobs for the Future and with Bob Schwartz, who among other things is my predecessor at Achieve, talking through how to come at defining career readiness. It turns out to be a term that, as you know, is pretty slippery. And so the first thing to do is to try to reach some consensus and agreement on what we mean by career readiness in the context of standards and assessments. And then lots of other issues from there we can go into if you want. I know you'll be talking with them more than we are. But what I wouldn't do is try to develop through PARCC an assessment that that basically employers use as a screening device. There are other things around there for employability skills, and secondly, I think that would put more weight on this assessment than it will be able to carry at this point. So we need some other way to come at those issues, and we'd be happy to talk to you about that.
Great. Did you want to say something, Laura? No.
Well, I think, Chair, there was one more question about the math sequence, and I just wanted to, if you want to hear the answer to that. Just in case there was confusion, PARCC will develop 2 math sequences, one which is Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Geometry, and the other which is Integrated 1, 2, and 3. Those are options, and a state can choose one or the other. It need not place kids into one or the other. So there are 2 trajectories, and that's really to give states choice so that the PARCC weren't sort of prescribing a particular sequence for all students in all schools across all PARCC states, but to allow some choice across states.
Yes, 1 second. So can you just explain integrated? Is that the integration of those subjects, or is it a different kind of math?
It's actually the same exact math, so it's taking the Common Core standards and just parsing them into 2 different course sequences. Typically, U.S. schools go an Algebra 1 Geometry, Algebra 2 route, sort of the more traditional U.S. courses that we see. In other countries and in increasing numbers of U.S. states, we're seeing a more integrated approach in which algebra and geometry and data and statistics are all more infused within a single course. And actually applied and pursued together.
Okay, so David, you have the next question, but before I go there, I want to introduce Board Member Ruth Kaplan to both. I think you've met Mike Cohen before, and maybe you've met Laura before, but they're our special guests from Achieve, and we're thrilled you're here tonight. Welcome, Ruth. The second thing I want to do, and Harneen mentioned it earlier, but of course Gerald Chertavian, who chaired the 21st Century Task Force, is also chairing our College and Career Ready Task Force. And he'll give a brief report at tomorrow's board meeting, I think, if his voice holds out. But just not to embarrass him too much, he's assembled a great group of people who are going to talk about this, Michael. So I think in addition to Bob Schwartz and Nancy Hoffman and all the other folks, there'll be some good and appropriate back and forth between Gerald's task force and Achieve. With that, David, you had a question?
A couple.
Great.
Succinctly, the differences between PARCC and Smarter Balance. You said they had a different approach. Could you just kind of zero in on that without a whole lot of...
The biggest difference is that PARCC is focusing on developing grade level assessments that measure how well students meet grade level standards. And so it's very clear to everyone what the expectations are. Smarter Balanced is using computer adaptive testing, which basically means a student sits down in front of the computer and starts answering a series of questions, and the computer tries to locate where their performance is. So a fourth grader might wind up taking a lot of third grade items because that reflects where they are, may or may not get a lot of fourth grade items. So it's a difference between a commitment to measuring grade level standards versus this adaptive approach that moves the test depending on where the student is.
Okay, and that's it? That's the difference?
That is the most fundamental difference
All right.
between the two.
And you mentioned that the states in PARCC have committed to the principle of the same cut scores. Is that a broadly arrived at consensus? And maybe I should ask the chair of the state offices. Is that the way this is going to come down?
Yeah, a key driver of the commitment of the states that are at the table, is it 16 governing states, 17?
18 now.
18 governing states, is to come up with a common standard for college and career readiness. The notion being that that opportunity after high school is less and less determined by your geographic location. And so having a common metric, a common standard for reporting, and I should point out the other purpose of the metric is to provide to students and their parents a certification of what a college will accept. So the flip side of that is that the colleges are very much part of the discussion in our state. Commissioner Richard Freeland of Higher Ed, so that there's enough confidence in the standard that gets set that if a student does score at that level, that student has demonstrated with sufficient reliability that he or she's ready for a credit-bearing course, entry-level credit-bearing course at least.
But it's also going to be for competency determination if, in fact, this becomes the new generation of testing, right?
So I'm glad you added that follow-up question. So that would be a state-specific determination, right? That goes to the observations that Mike made a few minutes ago, that you wouldn't want to set as a graduation requirement that every student has to be ready for credit-bearing coursework. If we did that, we'd end up with 30% graduation rate. I don't know if that's the right figure, but it would.
So it's conceivable that the states in the consortium could be using the same assessments. The kids would all be taking the same test, but they would determine what was a competency determination would vary from state to state, but the college readiness standard would be the same.
Would be constant. And just to add to that, David, there are states that don't have an exit exam requirement, right. So they don't even have a competency determination standard, right?
And my last question is, in terms of the psychometrics of the computer-based assessments, you have high confidence that they'll be there in terms of, because that'll be an issue if we move to transition to this, and so that there'd have to be a real strong field-tested evidence of that reliability, and you feel good about that and confident in that?
The research that needs to go on to determine the reliability and the quality is built into the process, so we'll be monitoring that along the way. We don't, with the advice that we've gotten from our technical advisory group, there's no reason to think that we can't achieve a high level of reliability with a computer-based delivery. Now, if you're asking about computer-based scoring,
Yeah.
right, that we need to watch even more carefully. That's a research effort, an R&D effort at this point, and the jury's out as to whether that'll be workable or not.
Right, and that's critically important in terms of where this evolves to at the state level, in terms of that confidence is going to have to be there before we move toward this for our own.
That's right.
Competency determination purposes.
Yes,
right.
Understood. And I expect.
So that'll get built all along.
That's right.
So we won't be asking that question at the end, right?
Right. So in terms of looking at the reliability of the assessments, we have pilot testing, we've got field testing, we've got research that will go on kind of within that process, and I don't think anyone is going to accept, any of the states is going to accept the use of assessments, computer-based or not, that don't meet or exceed current levels of psychometric quality.
It just has to be there for this to work.
Agreed completely.
Yeah, good. Thanks. I'm good.
So I have a small question. I'm sorry, I just saw your hand, but I started, Matthew, so I'll be next to you. But the decision not to use computers with children in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, was that made around cost, or was the consideration that it wasn't considered appropriate? And the reason I ask, of course, is that I know too many kindergartners who are better at computers than I am, and I grew up in technology. So
I know. That's scary.
You
isn't
know
it?
that about
I
me,
know.
Laura. That's
no,
really
I know that about my 4-year-old. She's way more advanced than I am. The decision about the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade assessments to be taken on computer, delivered via computer, but handwritten answered via handwriting, was because there's a sense among the states that there's a digital divide right now, and it is not the same for all kids in those grades, 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, to be able to just as easily keyboard in their answers. And so to make sure that the scores are really reflective of their content knowledge and not their keyboarding abilities, there was a sense that we needed to give them the option of doing handwritten responses. I think my crystal ball would say that will change over the lifetime of this assessment as earlier and earlier kids get access to technology and are much more facile with it, and so that those two things are no longer different constructs. Kids are just used to writing on a computer, and writing by hand is actually a different experience for them. I think we're in a transition period now, so we'd look a few years out to make that shift.
Okay. And then the second thing is just a memory. Do I remember, or did I make it up, that when Massachusetts released the content frameworks that Laura talked about earlier, that a lot of our teachers were feeding back, these are great, they're really not that different? Did I make that up, Bob Mitchell? I'm having a moment here where I'm saying, we already talked about this, right?
You did not make that up.
Okay,
you
good.
are correct.
I'm feeling so good right now. It's important in our, as we move from those to this more unified assessment system that actually makes more sense as a nation. And that's why I was, if we're such a tough client and customer, and we are, and our people who are the toughest, and our people the people who have to do the work, our teachers are buying in, then I'm happy, because I want to make policy around the right kinds of, with the right kind of data. So,
and many of the Massachusetts SEA staff, including Barbara Libby and Susan Weddle, were deeply engaged in that, as well as teachers across PARCC states. There was a lot of educator feedback. I think something over 2,000 individual educators who responded and provided feedback. Actually, what we've heard from them is that it would be nice if we had lots and lots of test examples now, or model student sample units right now, but in lieu of that, the best place for a teacher to start in terms of thinking about transition to the Common Core is with the content frameworks. We've heard that from educators in the field, so I'm just giving them some credit. We're very proud of that.
Great, thank you. Okay, Matthew, you have a question.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for coming here and giving this presentation. It's very interesting. My question goes for the speaking and listening section. So correct me if I'm wrong. So a student would give a presentation to either the classroom or somewhere the teacher would place them in a body of people. Is that correct?
The idea behind the speaking and listening is that it's pretty flexible. It's a requirement of the program so that all students will be assessed every year and their ability to present and to listen and to engage in dialogue. There haven't been, well, first of all, I should say this is still under development and the states are really figuring out what that assessment's going to look like. But this is one of the areas where the thinking in terms of the proposal was you could give a lot of teacher choice about the topic or the way in which it was scored, as long as teachers were using a standard rubric and the expectations were the same across classrooms and across states.
Okay. So, my only concern is, you know, as a student going through, I've had to give many presentations in my life. But you know, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, it's a very scary time for a student to go up in front of his peers and give a presentation. So I'm concerned that if we pressure students to stand up and speak in front of a body of people, it's gonna, you know, some people might not want to speak up and might not be able to do that. So something to consider when regarding the speaking listening sections, that some students might be, you know, still have that stage fright momentum going into presentations.
And some of us never grow out of that. So, no, I think it's really important. And one of the things you're highlighting is that expectations shift as students get older. And what might make sense for an 11th grader really doesn't in 3rd grade. There's still an important aspect of speaking and listening to assess and to ensure that all kids are getting access to that in their classrooms. But it may look quite different at those grade levels.
What are you concerned about?
What keeps us up at night? Well, you know, PARCC, this is a very ambitious development schedule, and there are some key milestones that have to be met, and PARCC is at this point on track and for an on-time delivery, but there are multiple milestones that come along every few weeks that we have to hit, and there's a very slim margin for error. But I will say that I think the biggest challenge to states is the technology infrastructure and really gearing up for that. Mitchell mentioned the technology gap assessment, and that's really a tool that states can use, states and districts should use in tandem actually. And the first window for that will be between April and July of this year, and then there'll be 4 other opportunities, so states can actually track their progress towards the goal of bringing all districts up to speed with their infrastructure. So that's a great tool, but it also requires political and financial wherewithal to keep that moving. And so I'd say for me, that's my biggest concern. It's out of the control of the PARCC development and really something that states and districts have to manage. You know, that's a great question underway right now amongst the states of whether depending on where their infrastructures are, could they skip over mainframes and just go directly to tablets, and could districts make that as a wise kind of future investment instead of trying to gear up with technology that may soon be outdated. So those conversations are happening, and PARCC will release this month its device specifications or minimum specifications to start enabling districts to make good purchasing decisions. I think we'll want to continue to relook at that as technology changes so quickly to make sure we're not going to be sort of outdated before districts won't be outdated before the assessment comes online.
Yes, Vanessa.
I have a couple of questions or concerns about it, and one of them definitely has to do with the technology part of it and the costs associated with that. You mentioned that you estimate it's going to cost about $11 per student per test, and that's not counting the diagnostic test, the mid-year test. So each one of those tests will be potentially $11. And I have another question, but.
Yeah, so we do estimate that the cost of the summative assessments will be about $11 a student, which is significantly less than you're spending right now. The mid-year assessment, the diagnostic assessments haven't costed out yet, but would expect they would be less costly than the summative tests. First of all, the test security issues are not the same, or not there, in fact. The diagnostic assessment, the plan is that that would be computer-based. Teachers could use that, could administer that when they want. The scores come back quite quickly online, if you will. There's not a whole lot of cost to doing that as many times as you want. It's not zero, but the idea is to drive it pretty close to zero. So basically the cost of the additional components ought not be as high as the cost of the summative components, and they're in control of, depending on how decisions get made, somewhere between the classroom teacher and the state or district. There's a lot of flexibility around that.
Okay, and that leads me to a second question in terms of human scoring of the tests. I think when you think about the teachers doing, being vested upon with that responsibility has, concerns me in various ways. First, if we're going to be using that potentially as an educator evaluation tool, it is an inherent conflict for teachers to be evaluating, right? It lends itself for a number of things. But secondly, and more important to me, is whether by giving that responsibility to teachers, we add on to the load of work that they have, to their caseload, to the workload, I mean, which may take time away from planning, curriculum instruction and development, et cetera, et cetera. So those are things that, as the states look into it, how do districts implement, I think would be, and I would definitely put it away from the teachers. And the last piece is, what is the timeline? I see that it's there on the screen, and we've been talking about, specifically for Massachusetts, about we have an accountability system, and I know that Mitchell talked earlier about how we want to integrate this and how do we transition from whatever we have now into PARCC eventually, if adopted. So what is the timeline, so we have a better sense on what that transition would look like for Massachusetts?
So the timeline for having the PARCC assessments developed, field tested, right, ready to go, is they will be and have to be ready to be used in school year 2014-2015. Now, whether that's when Massachusetts chooses to use it, how you want to run it concurrently or not with MCAS, what evidence you'll need to see about the relationship between the two, so that at a policy level and in classrooms around the country, people understand what the shift is an issue that you in each state is going to have to work through. Those discussions, I think, are just beginning. What we're in a position to do is at least set a context that will help states think through those issues and make the choices that they need to, but there's not, I think, a single answer for that. Your accountability system is designed differently than other states. How you would accommodate a transition from one assessment to another may be different. So I don't have a sort of simple, straightforward answer, but I can tell you that it's an issue that every state is thinking about, that depending on the nature of the growth model they use, the accountability system that they've got, there'll be different issues there, and you'll have to, ultimately you'll have to make the call on that.
I think Mitchell would like to.
Yeah. Yeah, you use the term teacher scoring versus artificial intelligence scoring, right? And so just to clarify, I think your caution is right on target, Vanessa, in terms of who scores the tests. Right now with the MCAS program, all of our tests have open-ended components, right? We distinguish between machine scorable and open-ended. All of our open-ended are scored by people. They're not scored in-state. They're scored by the testing company, arranges scoring centers, does training of the scorers, very rigorous controls. There is and has been for a number of years development of what's referred to often as artificial intelligence scoring, using computer technology, and this has a kind of a long kind of lead up to it, and some of it military based in terms of computer programming development to identify or develop ways in which you can actually get very sophisticated computers to actually evaluate and assess open-ended components of a response. Not talking about did the student pick the right letter A, B, C, or D, but a student writes an essay and how sophisticated, how well written is this essay, and that technology continues to evolve. And is getting pretty sophisticated as we speak, and offers some real interesting potential for bringing down costs, turning around results in a very quick way. Typically, in testing programs that are currently using the technology, they use it in conjunction with human scoring. So they'll typically they'll have a machine go through the scoring and have people go through the scoring, and make sure that the results are lining up. So this is something that part of the challenge here with this project is anticipating where the development curve is going to be 2 years from now, 3 years from now, because technology is evolving so quickly. So that's something that Achieve's done a great job of trying to stay on top of what's emerging in terms of technological advances that can be applied in this arena. I mean, even the Watson computer development that IBM did is an example of just how sophisticated some of this programming and computer application is becoming. So that's the most expensive, I believe, and Liz can back me up on this. Liz Davis, our testing director, developing tests is expensive. Developing good tests is an expensive proposition. But once they're developed, the most expensive part of the testing program is, in fact, the scoring. When you have open-ended components, you have to bring educated, we call them readers or scorers. We have to get and in our case, we're testing over 500,000 students. So you have to set up these scoring centers, you have to bring people into a room, you have to train them, you have to keep track of whether they're scoring accurately, and that's probably the most expensive part of the testing program. And we don't want to abandon those open-ended, more performance-based kinds of components. We don't want to rely solely on multiple choice kinds of items. So that's the piece that we're working on.
So I have another question. I'm not sure it makes any sense, but it won't stop me from asking it anyway, Michael. So this has to do with, we have educators trial running this. We have policymakers. We have people like the Governors Association, Achieve, and all kinds of experts. Do we have any capability, and maybe not until there's more of a prototype out there, to have students actually test drive some of this? The most exciting part about the Common Core standards in my mind is the rationale behind the changes that were made, the real understanding of the application of knowledge as opposed to rote memory. That's the great promise of a better assessment system, especially if there's curriculum embedded assessment. Can you get high school kids who have checked out, dropped out to, I mean, I know if they're that far along, maybe this doesn't make any sense, but I'm looking at this as a way of getting folks really keyed into readiness, whether it's for college or the kinds of application skills that careers need. And so it's a way to sort of re-engage them. So is that a really crazy question? Is it too early?
Yeah, I mean, we may each want to take a shot. I think what I heard,
I want students to try. I want students to have a voice here, if it's reasonable.
I think one way they'll get a voice is when the prototypes, for example, are developed. They have to be tried out with students, and so we'll get a lot of feedback from them about how those work, what their experience is like, how engaging it is, as well as other things like, did they understand the question, and did they understand it the same way that the folks who wrote it intended it. But at a somewhat different level, if the assessments, if we're successful with getting assessments that match, that really align with the Common Core, then the emphasis on critical thinking, problem solving, deep engagement with content, the ability to think and reason and the like. If we can create assessments that support and send signals that that's the kind of instruction that teachers need to engage in, then hopefully we'll have more students more effectively engaged in their academic work than is the case now, and that would be good that would be good all the way around. So that seems to me to be the big bet here, that and the big goal that we're after is to create assessments that are, if you will, worthy of being taught to and worthy of the kind of instruction and engagement strategies that the best teachers came into the profession to do.
Thank you. Yes, Beverly.
Well, thank you for coming. Appreciate it. I was just reading that some PARCC states intend to use the assessment to inform accountability in a way that they're not able to do it today. And I noticed that it's kind of your next step or stage in the process. Can you talk a little bit about that from the process of thinking about it and how you're perhaps integrating it with what you're doing now? And then my second question is, I'm trying to understand the concept of bridging between Common Core standards and the assessment tool that you're, to the structure that you're building. And let me understand how you're doing that, because those are two incredibly complex pieces to bring together to get more, it sounds like, than what the Common Core standard base is. You'll cover that, but it seems that you're adding to the whole structure as it relates to assessment. So can you talk about those two pieces?
Let me talk about the accountability piece, and Laura can talk about the sort of connection between the standards and the assessments. There are several different ways in which PARCC states are thinking about assessment and accountability that goes beyond what is current practice now. One is having assessments that actually measure college readiness, as we've talked about. Then that's not just a technical issue, right? We're at a point in our economy where the mission of the K-12 system has to be to prepare all students for post-secondary education and careers. And it's not or, it's and. Unless we can assess how well students are prepared and begin to build those metrics into the system for holding schools accountable, then we won't really have an impact on the mission of the K-12 system at a time when it's most critical that that fundamental shift be made. So this notion of assessing college and career readiness and students' progress along the way each year is, I mean, there's big technical issues in there, but the fundamental point here is the K-12 system, is the mission of the K-12 system being oriented towards the external world that students will be entering after they leave high school. That is a critical piece of this. Second sort of next step in accountability, if you will, that is most of the PARCC states are moving down, some with some controversy, some with tremendous controversy, is the use of the assessments as part of the tools for evaluating the effectiveness of educators. There are technical aspects to that about how reliably we are able to measure students, particularly high and low achievers. There are other aspects to that as to whether teachers who are being evaluated or administrators who will be using the assessments for evaluation find the assessments fair, measuring what is really important and what teachers are trying to do. And that's a different set of issues that PARCC is literally addressing as we speak. These are ongoing conversations about how best to get input on that, how best to get feedback from educators about the assessment design. So that is very much an ongoing conversation. I think we're at kind of in a pioneering stage on this. And as I said, states are in different places on this, and the policy and political issues around it are in quite different condition depending on the state. So that's a second area where there is, if you will, innovation in accountability, much of which started a little bit after PARCC was formed, and so we are trying to move with the policy discussions in states. The third is in a very different kind of way. I think of this as public accountability. We will have for the first time the ability to actually report student performance and growth in student performance and gains state to state in a common way. Up right now, states are literally all over the map in terms of what their standards have been and what their assessments are, and judging how well a system is doing with this, how well a public education system is doing with the assessment systems that are in place now really is quite difficult. If most of the states implement one or the other common assessment, we will have a very different environment in which we are reporting and understanding performance across the states, and the public is holding the systems accountable in a very different way for that.
Thank you.
Laura?
Thank you. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about the standards, because I think PARCC's real goal here is to measure with great fidelity the content of the Common Core standards, and to really bring that to life and make sure that that actually does become practice in our classrooms. So good measurement is one way to drive the standards down into the classroom in a number of ways. And I think Maura really mentioned this in terms of not just the content and skills, but also the application of that content and skills, so that really the tasks that PARCC puts forward through the assessment system embody the kind of things that you really want kids to be doing, because A, they're meaningful, and B, they prepare them for success, whether they go to college or directly into a high-skilled career. So with that as background, I think some of the important aspects of the standards can really be identified through the claims that PARCC is going to make about what students should know and be able to do. In ELA literacy, there's the big claim about students will be ready for college credit-bearing courses, first-year credit-bearing courses, but underneath that, it's what they can do in reading to comprehend rich, complex texts that are grade-level appropriate, because we know that's one of the key drivers of success or failure out in the real world, is whether kids can actually read and comprehend sufficiently complex texts. It's also important that the standards don't just privilege literature. Literature is a very important part of the standards, but there's also complex texts from science and social science and other informational texts, rich different kinds of media that students need to be able to engage with. And the PARCC assessments will use text from across a range of disciplines and multimedia in how they put in their development of items. So that's one aspect of them. We already talked a little bit about the speaking and listening, but there's another element in the ELA literacy side that we didn't really talk about earlier, and that's the research, the gathering of evidence, the using it to marshal a claim, and to actually write based on that evidence. In many writing assessments today, students are asked to write, and actually they're scored on how well their writing is, how well they write. So do they have a topic sentence or a thesis, and do they use good punctuation? What many writing assessments aren't scored for right now is the extent to which the ideas build on one another and actually make sense and have a logical chain of reasoning. That's one of the reasons the automated scoring is going to be so tricky here. We know how to score for just basic traits, but we don't actually know how to score for the development of rich ideas. And so that's one of the shifts that I think are most important on ELA. In the math side, I think one of the things that's so critical about the standards, for as much as rigorous as they are, and as much as they push the envelope on what students need to know and be able to do, they also really require teachers to do less in some areas and to focus their instruction, particularly in the early grades, on what matters most in terms of that foundation for the later years. And in mathematics, while that big claim, again, is readiness for entry into college and credit-bearing courses around college and career readiness, the underlying claims within each grade level are going to differ based on what the areas of emphasis are. So they're really going to hone in at each grade level on what is the most important content. And so that will be different in terms of the assessment. It'll be different in terms of classroom, what teachers actually do in classrooms, not just repeating and spiraling the same thing over and over again and doing the mile-wide, inch-deep curriculum that they, in some cases, are accustomed to, but really to say, what's the most important? What does that mean I teach, and what does that mean I don't teach? And the aspects of the way that the assessments are designed will really mirror that as well. So that's what I think is most important in terms of translating the standards into the assessments.
Great, thank you.
Great. So I'm going to turn the agenda back to the Commissioner in a minute, but as I do, I want to make sure I thank Sandy and Laura and Michael for being with us once again. Michael, this is time number 4, I think, since I've been on this board. It's the favorite state. Well, it's... I know. All right, so now he's pushed me. Now he's pushed me. I am going to tell you, he is a Giants fan. Okay, all right, Michael, you'll still get out of here alive, I promise. But in all sincerity, the partnership that Massachusetts has with Achieve is really something we value very much. So thank you for all that you do for the state. I hope you can stay. We're going to transition into a continuation of this conversation and bring it back to Massachusetts.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and my thanks also to Mike and Laura and Sandy for being here. And hopefully you don't have to run away, but I would like Liz and Sal Beattini to come up and Liz, I don't know if everybody's had a chance to meet Liz. Liz is our assessment director. Sal works for her. Liz reports to Bob Bickerton, our senior associate commissioner. And what I wanted Liz to do was to round out today's discussion by talking about some of the teacher tools, the school tools that are being developed through our Race to the Top project, our Race to the Top grant, so that you can hopefully walk away from this with an appreciation that the work we're doing is not solely about the assessment we administer statewide, but includes the kinds of tools that will support individual teachers and schools in their instructional efforts. So, Elizabeth?
Oh, there you go. Thank you, Commissioner. Good evening. Can I really quickly first introduce Steve Krastowski? He is our state park coordinator that we have brought on, and he's doing everything park for the state with Achieve, and we are still involved very much, but he's wonderful. So I just want to get that out of the way. What I want to remind everybody also is that PARCC is for ELA and math. And it's wonderful. We want to use our Race to the Top funds to now say, how can we expand and add to our assessment system besides just MCAS? We are doing that with, with 2 Race to the Top initiatives that are assessment initiatives that are going to parallel with what PARCC is doing, but it's a statewide. We are also doing it in math and English as well, but we're doing math, history, science, social studies. And they are the 2 initiatives that we are able to do because of the Race to the Top funding that we have, is the Curriculum Embedded Performance Assessments and Online Interim Informative Assessment System. Sal's going to talk about the online interim in a little bit, and I'm going to talk about the Curriculum Embedded Performance Assessments. So a Curriculum Embedded Performance Assessment is having students do something, as the Commissioner and Laura and Mike were saying, doing something beyond that end of course, end of year, sitting down, paper and pencil on demand assessment. It's having students engaged in an assessment that is part of and inserted into a curriculum or unit that they're doing in their class. Instead of an interruption, it becomes part of their curriculum, part of their unit. It can span over several class periods, several days, where they're engaged in assessing, evaluating, analyzing, really doing those critical thinking skills and responding to text, listening to speeches on the computer, interacting and having multiple parts of this assessment that they would respond to. So it's ideally, wouldn't it be wonderful if it could be that the students were doing this project not even realizing that it was an assessment, you know, that traditional assessment. So that's one of the tools that we're building with the curriculum, I mean with the, the curriculum and instruction unit. We're working together, the assessment unit and the curriculum and instruction unit, to build, they're building the model curriculum units that will be on our teaching and learning system. And embedded in those model units, there'll be 100 of them that we're developing right now, will be these SEPAs. And they will be part of these units. It will help drive instruction to hopefully be this enriching, engaging instruction that really calls on students to use those critical thinking skills, the ones where they have voice, where they can argue, they can write an argumentative paper, they can evaluate, math practices where there are many ways to approach this problem solving. And that's the tool that we're putting out and developing with teachers, with Massachusetts teachers. And where am I on my slide? I'm just kind of talking. Is that the next one? Are we all ready? Okay, so this is the actual SEPA project that I was just talking about. We actually, like the commissioner said, years ago, we actually put a proposal out, a RFR for a proposal to do a project like this, and funds, unfortunately, were cut. So we were able to get a Nellie Mae grant where we were able to start designing a curriculum embedded performance assessment model. And that's all we were able to do really with the Nellie Mae, is just to kind of design this, flesh it out, see how it would be. Now with the Race to the Top funds, we're going to really be able to take that and go further. We're going to do a little tryout this fall, spring with some teachers just in their classroom. They're just doing some of the ones that we've been working on with teachers. And then next year, the school year, we're going to actually do a small pilot with just 4 of the larger scale SEPAs that we're going to have teachers do for us. Okay, so again, how will assessments, okay, so this, I think I've already talked about the pilot. The pilot we're going to actually do distributed scoring. And distributed scoring, this might help you too, when we have teachers scoring, we don't mean they're showing their own student papers. They're scoring other teachers, and it may even be district-wide that there's distributed scoring. So there is a challenge that, how are we going to do that? We're going to have to do a lot of training teachers on how to score using not just a rubric, but student papers, anchor papers, and so that there is that consistency. Also, delivering an online assessment, again, is going to be a challenge. And our goal is how is this going to benefit? It's going to add to MCAS, and that it's making this a system. We have, Sal's going to talk about some optional assessments. It's optional model curriculum units that will be available to teachers. These SEPAs, hopefully, we're going to do some large-scale experiments, see how it goes with the SEPAs. It's not just going to be more and more assessments, but they're going to be quality assessments available, many of them optional, but it's going to be a system that is what doesn't wait to the end of the year. We can inform instruction, enrich instruction with these model curriculum units and these SEPAs. Sal, do you want to take over? Oh, question? Sure. I'm sorry. Okay. I could do it in ELA very easily because I'm ELA, but I did talk to our history person and ask him to give me a good example. But in ELA, it might be something where a teacher is working with their high school students on persuasive essays, argumentative essays, and they're doing a whole unit. Let's say that there was a menu of a few SEPAs that they could pull down and choose from that would be embedded in this. It would enrich that by, like one might be, student would sit and read a speech. Then they would hear a speech on the computer. They would maybe link on to a timeline of when the speech was delivered and what was happening in society during that time. Then they would write a little summary on the first speech and the rhetorical devices that was used to really engage the listeners, and they would do that for maybe both. And they might do a comparative analysis on how those, how effective were those speeches with delivering that rhetorical device and that use, and how powerful the speeches and which were more powerful and why. And so it's a combination of reading speeches, listening to speeches, understanding the timeline and what was going on in society at that time, or evaluating maybe propaganda pieces and trying to say where's the bias in that, and you know, why was it delivered that way. So it's that sort of thing, and it might take 2 days, 3 days, and 3 class periods, so that the first day they read one speech, do a summary, the second they introduce to another, and then do the comparative analysis.
The only problem we have, you can, but we have to finish by 7 tonight, and I want to make sure Sal gets, I mean 6. 6, I mean 6. People, okay. Okay.
So I'm just wondering if you're having things that are embedded, so that, I mean, it can be, sometimes performance can be different when students take something as a test or an assessment versus it's a classroom assignment. So I'm just wondering how you deal with the psychological aspect of that.
Well, I mean, the teachers have inside their unit, they're going to be assessing as they do now. This is supposed to be an enriching assessment that's going to guide instruction and assessment. So if they were doing a model curriculum unit and they had choice of several SEPAs or maybe one, the teacher could use this and it would count in their classroom how they want. It would be optional how they want to do that. Now, if we get to the large scale, which is what we want to do someday, and add that, couple that with an MCAS as we know it now, that would definitely count, but that's kind of a thing that we're working toward. But if a teacher uses these SEPAs, it's supposed to help guide instruction, which is what we're supposed to be doing with Race to the Top, and having the students understand whether it's accountable. It would be up to the teacher, I guess, how much it would count within that unit, because it would be optional. Is that, did I answer your, I'm sorry?
No, it's okay. I know you're not it's just something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Students approach assignments in the classroom differently.
Right. Well, and within their 2-day or 2 class periods engagement in this SEPA, certain components of the actual SEPAs would be labeled as, I will collect these will be the thing you're assessed on, it's worth so many points, etc. You know, so.
Time, but you talked about piloting this spring and also next year. Have you given some thought about what the sample looks like? What schools or groups will you pilot this with?
Sure. The spring is simply a few classrooms. The teachers that have been working with the model, with the curriculum and instruction units to build the model units, are going to actually go back to their classrooms and just try some of these SEPAs within the model unit, just to give us a beginning. So it's a very, very small scale. What we intend to do, or hope to do next year, is to pilot only 4, 1 for each content area, core content area. And again, it's a small, it's going to be a small pilot the first year. And we're actually working with Measure Progress and curriculum instruction to kind of figure out how many we're going to be able to do that first year, but it will be a small pilot. We're going to learn a lot, and that's the purpose of it, to see logistically and feasibility of this kind of assignment to go large scale.
Right.
Thanks very much. I just want to take a minute to go over one of these, the online interim informative assessment tool, which is something we're building, kind of keeping in theme with PARCC and with the SEPAs, are things that are going to give teachers information to make better decisions and better instructional choices and overall improve learning. So what we want to do is create this tool for all districts that allows them to create interim assessments, which are envisioning being more given on multiple classrooms or maybe across a whole district, and also allow them to make some formative assessments that can be made by a teacher and customized for their classroom, and also gives them ideas of exactly where the students might be at a point in time. And kind of showing the slide to say that we want to make the system flexible in the sense that it can make a really short, simple formative assessment for a teacher, but also could scale up to a lot more widespread things, not quite at the level of a large-scale assessment like MCAS or PARCC, but something at that level. And we know a lot of districts, we do know, have already invested in tools that can do this, but we know that there's a real disparity. Some districts have great ones they've invested a lot in, and some have none. So by producing this, we know it's going to be high quality, and we know it's going to be available to everybody. And districts can make a choice, you know, if it's better than what they have now, but at least we know this is something that all districts will have access to. So again, we want to build a robust tool that lets them build on-demand assessments, and they can be administered online as well as paper and pencil. And we've gone through, you know, we're still in the development stage, but we've gone through all of these online scoring and automated scoring options as far as teacher scored, distributed scoring, AI scoring, and we're investigating all those same tools with all the same challenges and pluses and minuses to incorporate. And the main part of this, we're going to start off with utilizing this large pool we have of high-quality released MCAS items. We've released our MCAS items since 1998, and we know right now lots of teachers use them. They cut and paste them off of our website, and there's no automated, convenient, or widespread way for them to do this systematically and efficiently. So what we're going to do is start off with, at its core, this test builder engine, which allows them to access all the released MCAS items. We're going to build in lots of functionalities, of course, to incorporate any more released items if it comes from PARCC, all the future released MCAS items, possible collaborations with other states that release their items. You know, we share items with New York. New York lets us use Regents items, whatever the case may be. So we want to really build up a large pool, but we know, even when we first launch, we know in hand we have a large number of released, vetted, high-quality MCAS items. We also envision teachers being able to edit, create, and make their own tests. And by using these tests, they upload them into the teaching and learning system along with their results, and they can share and make kind of a learning community where somebody makes a good test and shares it. People create their own items, edit items with their colleagues. And over time, within this teaching and learning system, we're going to have a large online assessment resource for everyone to use so they can get periodically, however often they would like to use it, feedback on their students, feedback on their classrooms, and actually, you know, make better decisions. Let's see, my last slide. How is it going to benefit teachers and students? And we've got a lot of pieces up here that kind of tie together the discussions we've had about giving timely information, how well are students mastering content, pieces about students who are way above or way below expectations of the classroom. But one way to look at it is if we make this tool in the best way, I think it's going to be able to be used at every level. For a teacher, can tell if their students are mastering content. For a principal, could roll this out across the school and say, of all these classrooms, which one seems to be doing the best job on this unit or this piece of content, figure out which is the best and model that. And then also on a higher level, a superintendent could go across many of their schools and focus on, you know, what techniques are working better, and it gives them more feedback. I mean, right now, the superintendent has one from the state, one end of year piece of data, the MCAS, and they can make decisions on that. But that's an end of year piece of data, and we want to give them opportunities to space that out over the year, focus their professional development, and, you know, make the best instructional decisions. And happy to take a few questions, but I think that's the real high-level overview. And this is something, again, we're procuring as part of the teaching and learning system, and it'll be procured over the winter, and it'll start to roll out in the fall with piloting in the spring.
So Jeff has a quick question, I think.
Very quick. I read in the accompanying information we got in our materials yesterday that we've got the money to do the curriculum embedded assessments right now, but we're not planning to actually implement these online interims?
No, that's a separate. I know we had, originally we had put into the MCAS contract additional pieces. We had the SEPA was in there, and there was no funding for that initially, but then the Nellie Mae grant allowed us to run a 6-month pilot that Liz referred to. We made a project plan. And then we kind of put that on hold until Race to the Top has allowed us to pick that project back up. That's for the SEPAs. The online interim informative is part of the Race to the Top, and it's on a schedule. It's ready to go.
All right, good.
Yes, Commissioner.
Yeah, I can only imagine you've heard an awful lot about assessment tonight, and you've heard about various projects. Just to try to knit some of what you've heard together. When in our run-up to our Race to the Top application and submission, we did extensive outreach to our educators to ask them, what do you need? What would be helpful? What's important? And overwhelmingly, the the development and access to assessments that they can use on their own terms in the course of instruction, curriculum resources, curriculum tools. Overwhelmingly, we're near the top of everybody's list. And so we built into our budget with Race to the Top the development of assessments, prototypes and protocols and instruments that our teachers and our administrators can use in the course of instruction, whether they use it, whether it becomes part of a student's grade. You know, virtually anything teachers give to kids generally becomes part of their grade, or doesn't, is really a local decision, a local matter. But it was definitely absolutely important to our teachers. It's been pointed out, many of our districts are spending their own dollars on these commercially available assessment tools. Some of them are pretty good quality. A lot of them are pretty low quality. So what we're developing through our Race to the Top grant and through the PARCC project are tools that are really aligned with the expectations that we've laid out in our curriculum frameworks, which incorporate the Common Core State standards in the case of math and English language arts. But what we're doing with our Race to the Top grant, as Liz said at the beginning, is we're focusing on more than just English language arts and math. We're providing these in the other subject areas as well. Just a note about Liz's appointment as our assessment director. Sort of shades of my own background here. I never kind of went to college or was groomed as an assessment person. And I was very much a classroom teacher and administrator in school buildings and ran the curriculum and instruction unit at the Connecticut Department of Education, and then got tapped by then Superintendent of Philadelphia to come in and run accountability and assessment. And he said, and I said to him, you know, I'm not prepared for this. This is not what I trained to do. And he said, that's what I want. I want somebody who comes at it with a curriculum and instruction lens. And Liz very much brings that to the table. She comes out of classrooms and schools from an English language arts background. So it's really great to have her bring that perspective to our assessment development.
Right. Well, yes, Vanessa.
Quick couple of comments. I appreciate that, Mitchell. And personally, I'm extremely excited about this presentation because looking at this type of assessment in which learning is integrated, there's a group assessment, I think is definitely something very exciting and that really engages students and teachers in the learning process. So I'm very excited about that. I may offer a suggestion as you look into piloting the CPAS, that you think of a diverse pool of students or schools to pilot this with, because what you don't want is to have a homogeneous group and then when you go into the real world it falls apart. So it's just so you have different perspectives. But great job.
Great. Well, let me thank both Liz and Sal, and through you thank Bob Bickerton for a great presentation. Again, thanks to our friends from Chief for being with us again. Meeting is adjourned.